In the gilded halls of the Spanish royal palace, behind doors guarded by silent sentries, a horror unlike any other unfolded over 38 years. A king sat upon one of the wealthiest thrones in Europe, yet his body betrayed him in ways so profound that courtiers whispered he was cursed by God himself. This is the story of Charles II of Spain, a monarch whose very existence challenged the limits of human suffering, and whose death marked the end of nearly 2 centuries of Habsburg rule. He was called El Hechizado, the Bewitched, but his true curse was not witchcraft, it was blood. The Spanish Empire in the 17th century stretched across continents. From the Americas to the Philippines, Spanish gold flowed into Madrid, enriching palaces and funding armies. Yet behind this facade of power and prosperity, the royal family harbored a secret that would prove more destructive than any foreign enemy. For generations, the Spanish Habsburgs had married their own cousins, nieces, and uncles, believing that by keeping power within the bloodline, they would preserve their dynasty forever. They were catastrophically wrong. When Charles was born on November 6, 1661, the court physicians immediately knew something was terribly wrong. The infant prince was weak, his limbs frail, and his cries feeble. His mother, Queen Mariana of Austria, herself the daughter of one Habsburg and the niece of another, wept as she held the child. His father, King Philip IV, had already lost multiple heirs to illness and deformity. Charles was his last hope for a male successor, yet even in those first moments, it was clear that hope was dangerously fragile. As the infant grew, his condition worsened. His head seemed disproportionately large. His jaw jutted forward in a grotesque underbite that made it nearly impossible for him to chew food. This deformity, known today as the Habsburg jaw or mandibular prognathism, had become a hallmark of the dynasty. Portraits of Charles's ancestors reveal the same distortion, generation after generation, each face more pronounced than the last. But in Charles, the defect reached its zenith. His tongue was too large for his mouth, causing him to drool constantly, and his speech was slurred and almost incomprehensible. The boy could not walk until he was 8 years old. His legs were weak and unsteady, his balance precarious. Servants had to carry him from room to room, a humiliating necessity for a future king. His mind, too, seemed clouded. He struggled to learn basic lessons, his attention wandering, his comprehension limited. Tutors despaired of teaching him Latin or history, or even simple arithmetic. Some wondered if the boy was possessed by demons, so severe were his afflictions. Modern geneticists have studied the genealogy of Charles II and determined that his coefficient of inbreeding was higher than if his parents had been full siblings. This was not merely the result of 1 or 2 cousin marriages, but the cumulative effect of centuries of intermarriage within the Habsburg family. Every generation compounded the genetic damage, narrowing the gene pool until hereditary diseases became inevitable. Charles inherited a double dose of harmful recessive genes, leading to a cascade of medical conditions that would plague him for his entire life. When Philip IV died in 1665, Charles was only 4 years old, far too young to rule. His mother became regent, but she was ill-equipped to govern an empire in decline. Spain was already losing its grip on European dominance, beset by wars with France and internal corruption. The young king was little more than a symbol, a sickly child paraded before the court on rare occasions, hidden away the rest of the time as his body continued to fail. Throughout his childhood, Charles suffered from seizures that left him convulsing on the floor, foam dripping from his mouth. Physicians bled him repeatedly, believing that draining his blood would restore balance to his humors. They applied leeches to his skin, heated glass cups to draw out poison, and forced him to drink concoctions of herbs and animal parts. Nothing helped. If anything, these treatments weakened him further. As Charles entered adolescence, his physical decline accelerated. His skin took on a grayish pallor, as though life itself was draining from him. Sores began to appear on his body, open wounds that refused to heal. His teeth, already malformed, started to rot and fall out one by one, leaving his mouth a cavern of decay. Eating became an ordeal. He could not chew properly, and food had to be mashed into a paste before he could swallow it. Even then, he often choked, his throat weak and uncoordinated. His hair, which had been thin since birth, grew thinner still, leaving patches of exposed scalp. His eyes, once a vibrant blue, became dull and sunken, ringed by dark circles that made him look decades older than his years. Courtiers who had not seen him in months were shocked by his appearance, some crossing themselves and muttering prayers as though they had seen a ghost. Indeed, Charles resembled a corpse more than a living man, his flesh clinging to his bones, his movements slow and labored. Despite his condition, the machinery of monarchy demanded that Charles marry and produce an heir. In 1679, at the age of 18, he was wed to Marie-Louise of Orléans, a French princess renowned for her beauty and vivacity. The contrast between bride and groom could not have been starker. Marie-Louise was horrified by her husband's appearance and repulsed by his constant drooling and foul breath. Letters she sent to her family in France described her life in Madrid as a living nightmare. The marriage was a disaster from the start. Charles was impotent, unable to consummate the union despite the desperate efforts of court physicians who prescribed aphrodisiacs and magical rituals. Marie-Louise endured 10 years of this humiliating charade before her sudden death in 1689, likely from appendicitis, though rumors swirled that she had been poisoned to make way for a new bride who might somehow succeed where she had failed. Within a year, Charles was married again, this time to Maria Anna of Neuburg, a German princess. She too was unable to conceive, and the blame fell squarely on the king. His body, ravaged by inbreeding and disease, was simply incapable of producing offspring. The Habsburg dynasty, which had ruled Spain for nearly 200 years, was doomed to end with him. By his 20s, Charles's health had deteriorated to the point that court doctors openly discussed his impending death. His kidneys were failing, his bladder swollen and painful. He suffered from chronic diarrhea and vomiting, his digestive system unable to process even the simplest foods. He was perpetually dehydrated, his lips cracked and bleeding, his tongue so swollen that he could barely speak. When he did manage to utter a few words, his voice was a rasping whisper, barely audible even to those standing close. The smell emanating from his body was overwhelming. Despite the efforts of servants who bathed him daily and doused him with perfumes, a stench of rot and decay clung to him. Courtiers held handkerchiefs to their noses when forced to enter his chambers, and many avoided him altogether, making excuses to stay away from the royal presence. Those who did attend him spoke of the unbearable odor, likening it to that of a corpse left too long in the sun. Charles's legs and feet swelled grotesquely, the skin stretched tight and shiny, leaking fluid that stained his bedclothes. His joints ached constantly, inflamed and immobile. He could no longer stand without assistance, and walking even a few steps left him gasping for breath. He spent most of his days confined to bed, propped up on pillows, staring blankly at the ceiling or the walls, his mind as ravaged as his body. The court, desperate for answers, turned to increasingly bizarre explanations for the king's suffering. Some blamed witchcraft, convinced that Charles had been cursed by enemies of Spain. Exorcists were summoned to perform rituals over him, chanting prayers and sprinkling holy water, claiming to expel demons from his body. Others believed he was being punished by God for the sins of his ancestors, the accumulated guilt of generations of Habsburgs manifesting in his tortured flesh. In truth, Charles was the victim of simple genetics. The relentless inbreeding of his family had concentrated harmful recessive genes to catastrophic levels. He likely suffered from multiple genetic disorders, including pituitary hormone deficiency, which explained his stunted growth and developmental delays, as well as combined pituitary hormone deficiency, which caused his infertility and many of his physical abnormalities. His famous jaw was the result of a genetic trait passed down through generations, magnified by inbreeding until it became a debilitating deformity. Modern analysis of his family tree reveals that Charles's parents were more closely related than typical first cousins. His father, Philip IV, and his mother, Mariana of Austria, shared a great-grandfather, and Mariana was also Philip's niece. This meant that Charles's family tree was not a branching tree at all, but a tangled web where the same names appeared over and over again. His 32 great-great-great-grandparents, which should have been 32 unique individuals, consisted of only 10 people. The consequences of this genetic bottleneck were written across Charles's body. His immune system, weakened by homozygosity, left him vulnerable to every illness that swept through the palace. He contracted smallpox, measles, and countless other infections, each one bringing him closer to death. Physicians marveled that he survived at all, attributing his continued existence to divine intervention rather than any strength of constitution. As the 1690s progressed, Charles entered a state of near-constant agony. Ulcers opened across his legs and abdomen, oozing pus and blood. His skin, already pale and sallow, took on a waxy, translucent quality, the veins visible beneath like dark rivers running through marble. He could not sleep through the night, waking every few hours in pain, crying out for relief that never came. Opium was administered, but it provided only temporary respite, and the doses had to be increased again and again until even that failed to dull the suffering. His mental state deteriorated in tandem with his physical health. Charles became increasingly paranoid, convinced that those around him were plotting his death. He accused his second wife of trying to poison him, a charge that was almost certainly false but understandable given his condition. He hallucinated, seeing figures in the shadows and hearing voices that no one else could hear. His grip on reality loosened, and there were days when he did not recognize his own attendants or remember his own name. Yet even in this state, Charles remained the King of Spain, and decisions of state still required his approval. Ministers brought documents for him to sign, guiding his hand across the page when his fingers were too weak to hold the pen. Ambassadors presented their credentials to a man who could barely sit upright, whose head lolled to one side, whose mouth hung open in a permanent grimace. It was a grotesque parody of kingship, a dying man, propped up as a puppet while others pulled the strings. The Spanish court became a place of ghoulish spectacle. Visitors from other European nations returned home with tales of the king's condition, describing him as a living skeleton wrapped in silk and brocade, a breathing corpse attended by physicians who had long since given up hope of healing him. Paintings from this period, though flattering by necessity, still hint at his true appearance. The artist unable to fully conceal the sunken cheeks, the drooping jaw, the lifeless eyes. In the final years of his life, Charles's body began to rot while he still breathed. His organs, damaged by disease and malnutrition, failed one by one. His liver, enlarged and inflamed, could no longer filter toxins from his blood. His kidneys, scarred and shrunken, produced only small amounts of dark, foul-smelling urine. His intestines, ravaged by chronic inflammation, bled internally, turning his stool black and tarry. He was, in the most literal sense, decomposing from within. The stench that had always surrounded him intensified to unbearable levels. Even incense and perfume could not mask it. Servants tasked with changing his bedclothes retched at the smell, and some fainted outright. The royal chambers, once the grandest rooms in the palace, became a place of horror, windows thrown open in a futile attempt to air out the miasma of decay. Courtiers spoke of the king's rooms as though they were a charnel house, a place where death lingered even while life persisted. Charles's mind, too, rotted away. He could no longer engage in conversation, his thoughts fragmentary and confused. He muttered to himself words that made no sense, sentences that trailed off into silence. His eyes, once capable of some expression, became glassy and vacant, staring at nothing, seeing nothing. Those who looked into his face saw not a man, but a husk, a shell from which the soul had already departed. The church proclaimed his survival a miracle, evidence of God's will that the king should endure such suffering. Priests prayed over him daily, administering last rites so many times that the ritual became routine. Charles was anointed with holy oil, blessed with sacred relics, and surrounded by icons and crosses meant to ease his passage into the next world. Yet still he lingered, his body refusing to surrender, even as it fell apart, piece by piece. By October 1700, it was clear that the end was near. Charles could no longer eat, his throat so constricted that even liquids caused him to choke. He was fed by forcing small amounts of broth between his lips, but most of it dribbled back out, staining his chin and chest. His breathing became labored, each inhalation a wet rattle, each exhalation a wheeze. His heart, weakened by decades of strain, beat irregularly, skipping beats and then racing as though trying to escape the failing body that contained it. On November 1st, 1700, All Saints' Day, Charles II of Spain finally died. He was 38 years old, though he looked twice that age. The official cause of death was listed as natural causes, a euphemism for the multitude of ailments that had ravaged him since birth. An autopsy was performed, and the findings were horrifying. His heart was described as the size of a peppercorn, shrunken and desiccated. His lungs were corroded, his intestines putrefied. His brain contained water instead of tissue, dissolved into liquid by disease and decay. The body, already in an advanced state of decomposition, despite the king having just died, began to collapse in on itself almost immediately. His skin, which had been stretched tight over his bones, turned waxy and yellow. His limbs stiffened into rigor mortis so quickly that attendants struggled to position him properly for burial. His eyes, which had been sunken in life, seemed to retreat further into his skull, giving his face a skeletal appearance that made even hardened courtiers turn away in horror. Witnesses to his death spoke of the relief they felt, not just for Charles, but for themselves. The burden of watching their king suffer, of pretending that he was capable of ruling, of maintaining the fiction that the Habsburg dynasty still had a future, was finally lifted. Spain could move on, though the question of succession would plunge the nation into war. Charles had named Philip of Anjou, a French prince, as his heir, a decision that would trigger the War of Spanish Succession and redraw the map of Europe. But the true significance of Charles's death lay not in politics, but in biology. He was the endpoint of a genetic experiment conducted over centuries, a living demonstration of what happens when a family tree becomes a family circle. The Habsburgs had believed that marrying within their bloodline would preserve their power and purity. Instead, it destroyed them, producing a king so debilitated that he could barely function, let alone rule. The lessons of Charles II were not learned quickly. Royal families across Europe continued to intermarry, though never again to such catastrophic effect. The concept of hybrid vigor, the genetic benefit of diverse parentage, was not understood until much later. But Charles's body, his suffering and his early death provided incontrovertible evidence that inbreeding was not a strategy for preserving dynasties, but a path to their extinction. Today, geneticists study the Habsburg family tree as a cautionary tale, a case study in the dangers of consanguinity. Charles's coefficient of inbreeding, calculated to be 0.254, is higher than that produced by mating between full siblings. This level of inbreeding is rare in human populations and typically leads to severe genetic disorders, as it did in Charles. His life, brief and agonizing, serves as a stark reminder of the biological imperative for genetic diversity. The portraits of Charles that survive today, housed in museums and royal collections, are themselves a kind of horror. Artists of the time were skilled at flattery, at softening the harsh realities of their subjects' appearances. Yet even they could not fully disguise the deformities that plagued the king. His protruding jaw, his vacant stare, his frail frame, all are visible in these paintings, a testament to the suffering he endured and the genetic catastrophe he embodied. Charles II was buried with full royal honors in the royal crypt at El Escorial, the great monastery palace northwest of Madrid. His tomb lies among those of his ancestors, the long line of Habsburgs who ruled Spain with varying degrees of success. But while his forebears are remembered for their conquests, their political maneuvering, and their cultural patronage, Charles is remembered only for his suffering and the genetic legacy that made him a symbol of dynastic decline. The nickname El Hechizado, the Bewitched, clung to him even in death. For centuries, his condition was attributed to supernatural forces, to curses and demons and the wrath of God. It was not until the 20th century, with advances in genetics, that the true cause of his afflictions became clear. He was not bewitched, but inbred, the victim of his family's obsessive desire to keep power within their bloodline at any cost. The cost, it turned out, was catastrophic. Charles II paid for the sins of his ancestors with every moment of his tortured existence. He lived a life of unimaginable pain, unable to eat, walk, speak, or think with any normalcy. His body rotted while he still breathed, his organs failing, his skin decaying, his mind dissolving. And when he finally died, it was not a release, but an inevitability, the conclusion of a process that had begun generations before he was born. In the annals of history, few figures have suffered as Charles II did. Kings have been murdered, tortured, and executed, but their suffering was inflicted by others. Charles's suffering was inflicted by his own blood, by the genetic code he inherited from parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents, who were far too closely related. He was a victim not of cruelty or war, but of biology, of the inexorable laws of genetics that cannot be defied without consequence. The Spanish Empire, which had reached its zenith under Charles's ancestors, declined sharply during his reign. Wars were lost, territories ceded, and the treasury emptied. But these political and military failures were symptoms of a deeper rot, one that began not on the battlefield, but in the marriage bed. The Habsburgs' insistence on dynastic purity hollowed out their strength from within, producing heirs too weak to defend what their forebears had built. Charles's inability to produce an heir meant that the Spanish throne would pass to a different family, ending the Habsburg line in Spain. The Bourbons, who succeeded him, were no less prone to intermarriage, but they had a larger gene pool to draw from. Still, the lesson of Charles II should have been clear. Inbreeding produces not strength but weakness, not purity but decay. It is a lesson that applies not only to royalty, but to any population that becomes too isolated, too insular. Modern geneticists have used Charles II as a case study in the effects of extreme inbreeding. His family tree, meticulously documented by historians, reveals patterns of consanguinity that would be considered dangerous even in animals. The same ancestors appear multiple times in his lineage, contributing genes over and over until harmful recessive traits had nowhere to hide. In a genetically diverse population, such traits might be masked by dominant alleles. In Charles, they were laid bare, expressed in every cell of his body. The physical manifestations of his inbreeding were obvious to anyone who saw him. The Habsburg jaw, which had been a distinguishing feature of his family for generations, reached its grotesque apex in his face. His inability to chew, his drooling, his slurred speech, all were direct consequences of this deformity, but the internal damage was even worse. His organs, malformed from birth, struggled to function. His immune system, compromised by homozygosity, left him vulnerable to disease. His mind, clouded by developmental delays and neurological damage, could not grasp the complexities of ruling an empire. Charles's physicians, working with the limited knowledge of their time, did their best to treat him. They bled him, purged him, applied poultices and tinctures, and prayed over him. None of it worked because none of it addressed the root cause of his suffering. He was not ill in the conventional sense. He was genetically broken, his DNA a tangled mess of duplicated and damaged sequences. No amount of bloodletting or prayer could fix that. The autopsy report, with its description of a peppercorn-sized heart and corroded lungs, reads like something from a horror story. Yet it is a real document, written by real physicians who cut open the king's body and recorded what they found. Their findings confirm what modern genetics would later explain. Charles II was a biological disaster, a human being pushed beyond the limits of what the species can endure. That he lived to 38 is remarkable. That he lived at all is a testament to the resilience of the human body, even when dealt the worst possible genetic hand. In the centuries since his death, Charles II has become a symbol, an example cited in textbooks and lectures on genetics, history, and the dangers of inbreeding. His story is told not to mock him, but to illustrate a fundamental truth: diversity is strength, and isolation is weakness. The Habsburgs learned this lesson too late, and the cost was measured not just in political decline, but in human suffering. Charles spent his entire life in pain, unable to enjoy even the simplest pleasures that most people take for granted. He could not eat a meal without choking, walk without stumbling, speak without slurring, or think without confusion. He was trapped in a body that was betraying him from the moment of his birth, a body that rotted even as it lived. And through it all, he was a king, expected to fulfill duties and perform rituals, to be a symbol of power and authority, even as he embodied weakness and decay. The courtiers who attended him, the servants who bathed him, the physicians who bled him, all bore witness to his suffering. They saw the sores that would not heal, the smell that would not fade, the mind that would not focus. They watched him deteriorate day by day, year by year, until death finally claimed him. And when it did, they felt not just grief, but relief, a collective exhale at the end of a nightmare that had lasted nearly 4 decades. Charles II's legacy is not one of conquest or culture, but of caution. He is a reminder that the pursuit of purity, whether genetic, racial, or ideological, leads not to perfection, but to degeneration. The Habsburgs believed they were preserving their dynasty by marrying within their family. In reality, they were destroying it, one generation at a time, until Charles embodied the final inevitable collapse. His death in 1700 marked the end of an era, the conclusion of the Spanish Habsburg line. The War of Spanish Succession that followed reshaped Europe, but it was Charles's life more than his death that left a deeper mark. He was a living warning, a cautionary tale written in flesh and blood, a demonstration of what happens when families turn inward and refuse to let fresh blood into their lineage. Today, visitors to El Escorial can see the tombs of the Spanish kings, including that of Charles II. The crypt is dark and solemn, the air heavy with the weight of history. But standing before his tomb, knowing what is known now about his life, it is impossible not to feel a profound sadness. Here lies a man who never had a chance, whose suffering was predetermined by the choices of those who came before him, who paid the ultimate price for the vanity and short-sightedness of his ancestors. The story of Charles II is not just a historical curiosity or a genetic anomaly. It is a human tragedy, a life defined by pain and loss, by the failure of a body that could never have been whole. He was the most inbred king in history, a title that carries with it not glory, but horror. And he was a king who rotted alive, whose body decayed even as he breathed, whose suffering was so profound that his death was seen not as a loss, but as a mercy. In the end, Charles II's life serves as a stark reminder of the importance of genetic diversity and the dangers of isolation. His story is written in medical records and autopsy reports, in portraits that cannot fully hide his deformities, in the historical accounts of those who witnessed his decline. It is a story that should not be forgotten, for it teaches a lesson that remains relevant today, that purity is an illusion, and that strength comes not from sameness, but from difference. Charles II of Spain, El Hechizado, the Bewitched, lived and died as a prisoner of his own genetics. He was a king who could not rule, a man who could not live, a body that rotted while the heart still beat. His is a story of suffering without parallel, a life that began in deformity and ended in decay. And it is a story that must be told, not to sensationalize his pain, but to honor his memory and to ensure that the mistakes of the past are not repeated. The Habsburg dynasty, for all its power and wealth, could not escape the consequences of its own choices. In their quest to preserve their bloodline, they poisoned it, generation after generation, until Charles II was born, a living embodiment of genetic collapse. His death ended the dynasty's rule in Spain, but his life ended something far more profound, the belief that purity could be maintained without cost. Charles II paid that cost in full with every moment of his tortured existence. And so we remember him, not as a great king or a tragic hero, but as a victim of circumstances beyond his control. He was born into a world that expected him to be something he could never be, that demanded of him things he could never provide. He suffered not because of his own failures, but because of the failures of those who came before him. And in suffering, he became a symbol, a warning, a lesson written in the most painful terms imaginable. Charles II, the most inbred king in history who rotted alive before he died, now rests in a stone tomb beneath a Spanish monastery. The gold and silk that once adorned him have long since turned to dust. The courtiers who whispered about his afflictions are centuries gone. But his story remains, preserved in the historical record, a testament to the limits of human endurance and the consequences of genetic folly. He lived a life no one should have to live, and he died a death that was, in many ways, a mercy. May we learn from his suffering and never repeat the mistakes that created it. The tale of Charles II is one that transcends time, a reminder that even kings are subject to the laws of biology, that even empires can fall not to external enemies, but to internal decay. His was a life of constant pain, a body that failed him at every turn, a mind that could not grasp the world around it. And yet he endured for 38 years, a king in name, but a prisoner in reality, trapped in a decaying shell from which there was no escape. As we close this dark chapter of history, we are left with questions that have no easy answers. How much can one human being endure? At what point does survival cease to be a blessing and become a curse? Charles II lived those questions every day of his life, and in his death he provided an answer. There are limits to suffering, and there is mercy in release. His story is not an easy one to tell, nor is it pleasant to hear. It is filled with suffering and decay, with the slow dissolution of a human being who was, through no fault of his own, doomed from birth. But it is a story that must be told, for in telling it, we honor not just Charles, but all those who have suffered through circumstances beyond their control. We remember him not as a monster or a curiosity, but as a man, a human being who deserved better than the life he was given. And so we leave Charles II in his tomb, beneath the stones of El Escorial. His suffering finally ended, his body at rest. The Habsburg dynasty that produced him is gone, dissolved into history, its legacy one of both greatness and tragedy. But Charles himself remains a cautionary tale, a symbol of what happens when ambition and vanity override the fundamental laws of nature. He was the most inbred king who rotted alive before he died, and his story is one that will be told as long as there are those willing to listen to the lessons of the past. In the final analysis, Charles II was a victim, not a villain. He did not choose his parents, his genetics, or his suffering. He was simply born into a world that had been shaped by the decisions of others, decisions made long before he drew his first breath. And in that sense, his story is not just about inbreeding or the decline of a dynasty. It is about the human condition, about the ways in which we are all, to some degree, prisoners of our inheritance, shaped by forces beyond our control. But unlike most of us, Charles II's inheritance was one of pain and deformity, of suffering so profound that it defied description. He was dealt the worst possible hand by the cruel randomness of genetics, amplified by the deliberate choices of his ancestors. And he played that hand for 38 years, enduring horrors that would have broken most people far sooner. In that sense, his life, as miserable as it was also a testament to human resilience, to the stubborn refusal of life to surrender even in the face of overwhelming odds. The medical details of Charles II's condition, gruesome as they are, tell only part of the story. Behind every symptom, every deformity, every moment of pain was a human being, a person who felt and thought and hoped, even if those hopes could never be realized. He wanted to be a good king, to fulfill the expectations of his position, to produce an heir and secure the future of his dynasty. That he failed in all of these things was not his fault. It was the inevitable result of a genetic catastrophe that began long before he was born. Today, we understand inbreeding depression, the phenomenon whereby closely related individuals produce offspring with reduced fitness. We know about recessive genetic disorders and the importance of genetic diversity in maintaining healthy populations. But this knowledge came too late for Charles II. He lived and died in an era when such things were not understood, when his suffering was attributed to demons and curses rather than chromosomes and genes. And in that ignorance, he suffered all the more, subjected to treatments that harmed more than they helped, blamed for afflictions over which he had no control. The physicians who attended him, the courtiers who served him, the priests who prayed over him, All did what they could with the knowledge they had, but their best efforts were futile, for the damage was done before Charles was born, encoded in his DNA, expressed in every cell of his body. He was, in a very real sense, a dead man from the moment of conception, his fate sealed by the choices of those who came before him. And yet he lived for 38 years, a span of time that must have felt like an eternity. Every day brought new pain, new indignities, new reminders of his body's failure. He watched as his teeth fell out, his hair thinned, his skin turned grey and began to rot. He felt the agony of ulcers that would not heal, the burning of organs that were failing, the confusion of a mind that was dissolving. And through it all, he remained king, a title that offered no comfort, no escape, only the burden of expectation and the humiliation of public display. In the end, Charles II's story is one of the darkest chapters in human history, a tale of suffering so profound that it challenges our understanding of what it means to be alive. He was a king who could not rule, a man who could not live, a body that rotted even as it breathed. His is a story that must be told, not to entertain or horrify, but to educate and warn. It is a story that reminds us of the importance of diversity, the dangers of isolation, and the terrible price of vanity and ambition unchecked by wisdom or compassion. Charles II of Spain, the most inbred king who rotted alive before he died, now rests in silence, his suffering ended, his story preserved. May we learn from his life, may we honor his memory, and may we never allow such a tragedy to happen again. For in his suffering, we see a reflection of our own vulnerability, our own dependence on the choices of others, and the fragility of life itself. He was a king, a man, and a victim, and his legacy is one that will echo through the ages, a warning written in the most terrible terms imaginable.